Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for taking time to join us for this first-year seminar kickoff lecture. My name is Kundai Chirindo. I am an associate professor teaching in the Rhetoric and Media Studies department, as well as in the Ethnic Studies program. I am also the director of general education. I want to begin by extending a very special welcome to all first year and all first time students who are joining us this afternoon, and to all of your families and friends as well. As some of you may know, this event marks the official launch of our new general education curriculum, Explore, Learn, Engage. Now, I know at least for a few of you, this is not an interesting topic, general education, that is, because, well, you might think that it's not your major, or that it takes important time away from your pursuit of the things that you really want to go after. If this is you, let me beg your indulgence for just two observations. The first observation I want to make is this: that the liberal arts is about a well-rounded and balanced education. And part of what that means is that in practical terms, we are not the kind of institution where if you are going to be, say, a biology major, all you will take are biology classes. That the liberal arts intends to help you approach situations from a variety of different disciplinary perspectives. And so we're going to expose you to those different disciplines while you are here. The second thing I would note is this: you should know that here at Lewis and Clark, our general education is not just a model of education. For us, general education is about you in a very specific sense. Here's what I mean. When your professors started the process of designing this new general education curriculum, we didn't start by asking ourselves, what should we teach, or what should be included in the general education curriculum? We began instead by asking, who do we want LC graduates to be? What kind of people do we want to graduate from here? That's what drives your general education and our general education at Lewis and Clark College. So let me start by sharing 8 things that I hope and that we hope you can do as a result of your education here. When you graduate, we hope that you will have, first, mastered the modes of critical inquiry through writing, conducting qualitative and qualitative scientific analyses, and through acquiring and evaluating evidence. We hope that you will have stretched yourself as a scholar, a researcher, and artist to achieve a very high degree of facility in your area of interest. We hope that you will have gained confidence to range across the disciplines, both individually and in collaboration with others. We hope that you will have engaged constructively with cultural difference and power, and we hope that you will have grounded your education in local, global, and historical contexts. We also hope that you will have encountered wonder and just grappled with experiences that are not just about seeking answers. We hope that you will have practiced the habits of self-care, community, and well-being. And finally, we hope that you will have reflected critically on your liberal education and its purpose in the contemporary world. These 8 principles are the ideals that we hope one leaves Lewis and Clark with. And we believe that it is these ideals are the path to how we make this world a more humane place. I'm pleased to tell you that we're joined this afternoon by 3 of my colleagues whose work, as you saw in their talks, embodies the kind of careful, thoughtful exploration and passionate engagement with the world in which we live, and hope that every single Lewis and Clark student will be able to engage in. In the order that you heard from them on the presentations, they are Dr. Diana Leonard, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, Dr. Reiko Hillier, an associate professor in the Department of History, and Dr. Shweta Suryanayaran, an assistant professor with term of mathematics. We're going to kick off things by asking a question to our panelists that was solicited from among the first year students. And I'm going to ask them to answer this question by telling us a little bit about the backstory to the talks which we watched on the recordings. After that, I'm going to give them an opportunity to respond to each other and ask themselves some questions. And then we're just going to work through some of the questions that we received. And I want to thank each and every one of you who submitted questions. We obviously are not going to be able to get to every single one of those questions, but I hope that the questions we do ask this afternoon resonate with some of the things that you were concerned with. So let me begin with you, Reiko, and ask you this question that we received from Ilana, who wonders, how did you get into studying these topics and the research that goes along with them?
Hi there, Kundai, and thank you, everyone, and thanks for that wonderful question. It's a longer answer than I can give here, but very, very briefly, I used to be a high school history teacher when I graduated from college for almost a decade, and I fell in love with history by virtue of having to teach it. I did not major in history in college, but in order to find meaning and relevance to excite myself as well as my students, I really started to dive into the work of history. But then when I decided to take a summer seminar for high school teachers, I discovered that I was really interested in archival research and to developing my relationship with history more deeply. And the moment when that happened was I was looking through a book in the library that was just a compilation of runaway advertisements for runaway slaves. Just one after the other, just the advertisement, no commentary. And one after the other, the advertisements written by the masters of these slaves describe the slaves as loyal, with a humble, downcast look. And there was no reason for him to run away. He absconded without any provocation. And over and over and over again, I saw this pattern of slave owners describing the fugitive slave as loyal. And I began to sort of think about the stories that the slave owners convinced themselves of in order to believe that a loyal slave would run away. What kind of ideology did they construct that could square that circle, that could make sense of that contradiction? And I decided to explore the topic of slavery in more depth, which led me to graduate school under the mentorship of an incredible professor, Barbara Fields. And that led me to the study of the South, which led me to African American history, which led me to the history of mass incarceration.
Thank you for that wonderful answer, Reiko. Diana, do you have an answer to that question?
I do. So for me, I was an anthropology major when I started college, actually. And this was because I took a course in high school on anthropology that really inspired me. And it was something about, what I can remember is a story about when they discovered Lucy, which was an Australopithecus, that they discovered that the celebrations around that, they named it the woman that they had discovered Lucy because her fossils, they were listening to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds when they were celebrating this discovery, and that's why they named it that. And something about this process of exploration, discovery, collaboration with others really was exciting to me. So I started college as an anthro minor, but I was quickly lured away by psychology because of the empirical methods that I found to be appealing in that field. And also because there was work study credit available, this is the honest truth. And so I got a job working in a cognitive lab and helping in the background doing research and even serving as a fake participant in some of those studies, and got to see firsthand those methodologies. And that just became more interesting for me. So I think this is important to note, that as you go along in your career at Lewis and Clark, you may find that where you started isn't where you end up, but I still use my knowledge and interest in anthropology in my pursuit of psychology research and interest as well. So I'm taking courses in psychology in college, and I'm really excited also about social psychology, because the thing that excited me about that is that it could help me to understand questions that I already had within me about identity and race, and the way people perceive others based on group memberships and visual cues and features of behavior that cause people to stereotype or create expectations that will consequently have a feedback loop on the way that person may behave in the setting, or on consequences for that person's life journey. So those were questions I was asking, but I'm also working in this work study lab in cognition. I'm like, I really like these methods, but I really like these questions. What do I do? And so then I took a course called Social Cognition, which is the blend of the two. And you'll also find this, that there are often opportunities, either you create them yourselves or you may find them, to blend your interests together to come up with something wholly new. And I would echo Reiko's point about having a fabulous mentor, in that case, Jeff Sherman, who I did my undergraduate honors thesis on, mixed race identity and how it affects perceptions of racial stimuli. And then going on to graduate training with somebody who was themselves a mentor of Jeff at UC Santa Barbara. So following that trajectory, getting good mentorship early and often, and many different kinds of mentors, it has been an important part of my journey and really helped to keep me on track with having a fulfilling research career, and then also in teaching. Did that cover the question?
I think so. You did that wonderfully. Thank you very much. Sweta.
Hello. So my discussion might be slightly different from the other speakers, is because my research is nowhere close to the field of epidemiology at all. But being an educator and teaching subjects like calculus gives me an access into various fields. So if I want to give my backstory a little bit, I knew, I think from high school, before that was music, but at high school, that mathematics was the direction I'm going to go in, because I had two sort of subjects introduced to me. One was mathematical reasoning with proof by induction. So I really loved the abstract, creative part of math. At the same time, calculus was introduced, and I immediately did not know the utility of calculus. Haha, it feels funny as a professor of calculus now. But I think within a year of doing that, I got a chance to be in a lab where my dad was doing some research, and there was a virtual simulator for a light combat aircraft. And I remember being completely enamored by that. And then the person walked in, and I said, hey, and he told me like, hey, I made this. Do you like it? I'm like, yeah, it's really cool. What did you use? And I might be paraphrasing. He said, oh, mostly calculus. And I was like, oh, I see, it gets used. And then, of course, I started exploring, and I saw it's used in many fields. But as I went along, my research, actually, personal research of math, my natural intuition and instincts were more towards the more abstract, purer side of mathematics. But at the same time, teaching came to me very, very early. It was in high school. I immediately was part of a kind of a grassroots nonprofit organization where it was doing a bunch of things, but I saw it kind of build up in front of my eyes, and I was teaching and mentoring kids from underprivileged communities, marginalized communities. So that had a huge impact. And the way I felt I connected with those students from high school onwards was kind of explaining to them that because math has this polarizing effect on people, that don't think of math as a judge. It needs to be a supporter. If you want, think of it as like a stapler. Like, you don't have to love a stapler, but if you know how to use it, your life might be a little bit easier. So, and as I was teaching them, I constantly realized, kind of showing them what are the different fields that math supports. And just kind of taking that as a kind of a useful tool along the way was interesting. So that really kind of made me fall in love with teaching, as well as teaching applications through basic calculus. Maybe that was kind of the starting point. So now, as a professor in LC, I do teach a lot of the calculus almost every year, because I get to interact with students from different fields, and that's where I kind of, and I'm not an expert in most of the fields that calculus gets used in, but I enjoy kind of exploring it with my students. Sometimes they tell me applications that I might have not seen. And also my research on the side is on the pure side of mathematics. And people have questions about what is pure mathematics. That's a question for another time. If someone has it, I would probably answer that too. But those are my two kind of places. I don't know if I answered that question accurately, but that's my story in this.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories about the different ways that you came to the things that you do, and demonstrating to us that it starts early, especially in the liberal arts tradition, where you have the opportunity to work closely with a mentor. I'm wondering, Reiko, if you have a question or a response to any of your other two co-panelists' presentations.
I sure do. Thank you. I really learned so much from both of them. And I have more than a single question, but I will try to boil this question down. So the one for Diana, thinking about this process by which people who or groups that are feeling under threat or preoccupied with death thoughts engage in symbolic coping by amplifying their self-esteem and solidifying a sense of belonging, sometimes punishing behaviors that are deviant. I'm wondering about the applicability of that process to different social groups depending on what material power they actually hold. So for example, there are white people now who are feeling under threat, whatever we may think of that. There is potentially a real threat to losing white supremacy. I mean, losing the power that comes from white supremacy, and also the imagined threat that is fostered by racist fear-mongering about Black criminals, for example. Whereas Black people would feel under threat for totally different reasons. And so I guess I'm just wondering how it is that psychologists figure those various positionalities in their analyses of this psychological process.
Yeah, so the TMT model, to my knowledge, is pretty clear that these processes are individual. And so so to back up a little bit, my field is social psychology, which looks at the intersection between the individual and the situation. So it's what are my needs and motives and coping mechanisms and perceptions and past experiences that I bring to bear, and how do those all interact with the stimuli, the environment, the pressures that I'm under, and even the structure of the society that I'm in, and the norms, et cetera. And so that's really the focus of research like that done by Pazinski and others in terror management theory. In some cases, they fairly argue that it is a process that can happen regardless of your power level within the society. In this, and to look at other theories of collective identity, this idea that when our group is under threat, regardless of the status of the group members, we are likely to want to reinforce group norms. And that can actually put a lot of pressure on groups that are devalued by the mainstream society or whose behaviors are negatively stereotyped, and because there's this dual pressure to fit in with the larger society and its norms and values, but also because the group that you care about, a politicized group membership, such as a racial category that has years of oppression in the community, you're likely to want to fulfill the values and norms of that group because that is the one for whom you have a common outcome, a need to belong, a need to survive together. So this puts what we know about as a double consciousness on African Americans, because there is this dual pressure to be a good quote unquote American, and we know that the ideal American that is demonstrated in mainstream media and culture is a whiteness value, but as well to be a good member of the Black community. And so that means that not only are the pressures that are discussed in the TMT model when death threat, such as from a pandemic or from state violence, makes the need to bolster self-esteem higher, but also you're torn because which group am I trying to fit in with? And to do one may be to become undesirable or further oppressed by the dominant norms and values. Does that answer your question? Unfortunately, I don't have happy answers, just answers rooted in research and empirical discovery.
Thank you, Diana. Do you have a question for Sweta?
Yeah, I have a question for Sweta, which is about sort of the model, the SRI model that you talk about, which is very interesting. And I actually had, I'm just going to put a plug because Margaret Metz also gave some of the faculty a little bit of a demo of that when we were talking about teaching using certain small group cohort methodologies, because we all get together and kind of give each other peer tips on teaching and what we've been trying in the classroom and how to develop those skills. You know, education is an ongoing process for everyone. And so I got to experience that where we did in January a simulation of what happened if zombies were to attack Palatine Hill. And I just remarked that those sort of fun, lighthearted discussions then became very real as the pandemic struck. And so my question is that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we obviously had assumptions in the model that needed to be just made off the cuff. And so the idea here that S equals 1 is one of the assumptions you mentioned, but also assumptions that recovery, for example, means that you're no longer susceptible. So how do the folks who are modeling using SRI or other methods kind of on the fly, or how do they incorporate information and data as they come in?
That's a phenomenal question, and that's definitely something that research are currently thinking about constantly. So the SIR model was based off of the set of diseases which were very different from COVID-19. There are more other aspects of COVID-19 we are realizing as time goes by. So in fact, the SIR model that I used was just to kind of indicate how math modeling is in there, but the actual model that is being used in COVID-19 already splits the population group into 4 categories instead of 3, the SIR, the susceptible, infected, and removed. They have the susceptible, exposed, infected, and removed. And the exposed part is where someone might be infected but might not be infectious. There's a latency period. So that's one thing. And to your point, you said that from COVID-19, we don't know that having it means total immunity. Just like flu, it can come back. So the SE, again, just like SIR, which is not a one model, it's actually a category of model which uses 3. The SEIR model is also a category. And I wish I could, do you mind if I just draw a picture that actually will, I need to write, is that okay? Oh, all right, let me just try to do this. Sorry about taking a second to do that, because I feel it might be useful for others to see this. Oh, I can't share the screen, never mind, sorry. Then I'll try to verbally do this. All right, I'll stop trying that. Okay, so let me use my hands. So think of it as sort of like a flow chart. We have SIR, and we have an arrow going from S to I, which is sort of the susceptibles go into the infected, and the infected go into the removed. But the SEIR model, you put another object in the middle. So you have susceptible going into exposed, exposed going into infected, and infected going into removed. So there's a longer kind of flow. But then you have an arrow coming back from recovered all the way to susceptible. And so you can actually create a slightly different equation, which takes into account that after a certain point, you are back to being in susceptible group. Does that make sense? Sorry, it took a second. I was hoping I could draw it out, but there you go. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Sweta. Do you have a question for Reiko?
Oh, yes. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed both Diana and Reiko's presentation, because again, that's again an advantage of being in the liberal arts program for me, because I didn't grow up in that, is kind of learning from the other professors. So the one aspect of Reiko's presentation that really struck my mind, starting with a comment, is the use of language, how critical that is in the telling of stories. I think specifically she said about the term officer-involved shooting versus a police officer shot someone, and how that makes an impact on the person understanding the story. But coming from the point of view of a non-native speaker, sorry to put my context in the middle, it was that when we have language being such a critical role in telling of stories, but I think language is also critical in listening of stories. So yes, internet is really impacting how the world is getting to know the information, but I feel that more and more people understand English. So that might have, does that impact how we are listening to stories coming out of the US specifically, because English is so dominant? And maybe is that, I don't know if that fits into the talk exactly, but do you think that also impacts how the world is perceiving the Black Lives Matters movement? Because not only about this, the outrage and protest in the corresponding countries, but how the world is kind of holding US accountable for making a change. Like, I think, at least from my personal experience talking to people back home, there's a charged emotion towards the movement. So I just was wondering, the fact that now a lot of us do understand English, does that impact how we record history from here onwards? I don't know if that makes sense. So that's my question.
It does make sense. And I don't know if I have a satisfying answer, but I think that one of the things that you're suggesting, which is kind of exciting, is that the hegemony of the English language is now being used to turn colonialism on its head. In other words, the very fact that this is, for better or for worse, a global language can help facilitate a global movement. And this was true during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when US radicals were traveling to Cuba and traveling to China and traveling to the Soviet Union, creating a kind of foundation for a diasporic, what came to be known as a third world liberation movement. But I would also suggest that the hegemony of English points to the extent to which we're missing stories if we can't read them or hear them or understand them. And I go to the work of my colleague, Elliot Young, who is one of the pioneers, to use that word, of a field called transnational history. And as with everything else, the profession of history itself has a history. And in the past 20 or so years, folks have begun to recognize that the nation state itself is not only a social construction, but was the object and engine behind the development of the historical profession itself. And the way that we are sort of standing on the shoulders of those who wanted to scientize history as a way of legitimating their nation state. And that means that the profession of history still rests on training in national archives. And what that sometimes means is that we miss those stories that spill over national boundaries or travel across national boundaries in multiple languages and through multiple openings, so to speak. And so I do think that it's important to think about language not only as a communicative tool, but also one that silences, and that it can define the limits of what we can study. I, took a test in graduate school to demonstrate that I was proficient in reading French, but ultimately the fact that I can't read in multiple languages will limit my ability to do research in certain countries or certain communities, and it will shape the kinds of stories I tell. So my English dominance is also my limitation.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. To all of our participants, we have just crossed over the halfway mark of this webinar, and I just wanted to mark that because the panelists have done an excellent job of keeping to the time limits I gave them. I wanted to use half of our time to answer your questions, the questions that you submitted to us. So for the remainder of our time together, I'm going to start asking questions that we received from first-year students. And I wanted to go to you first, Dr. Leonard, and in a way that sort of follows up on a theme that Reiko was talking about in her answer to Sweta. Ollie asks this question: Dr. Leonard, working in psychology, how do you find that balance of using the field to provide help and do good, while also grappling and fighting the complicated and harmful past actions made in the name of psychology?
That is a really good question. So it's pitched at me personally, so I'll address that first, and then if I have thoughts about more what my colleagues are doing or other ideas, I'll throw those in. Um, to be frank, I was educated in an entirely white-centered department, which most of them are going to be. And I had moments in my training where when I realized that I had more knowledge about history of oppression and social injustice in this country by virtue of my Black heritage than by my mentors who had decades on me in doing research in a field in which their focus was race and prejudice and identity and stereotyping. So I would be giving, as a first or second year graduate student, a talk about my research that I wanted to do, and would have to take a step back and explain, okay, who's Emmett Till though? Because we don't know. And that kind of experience of needing to educate my mentors about these topics has been part and parcel of my time in this research area. So in many ways, just trying to recognize within me the strength and the knowledge that I bring to bear, and to not undermine that or to think that it is of less value because it isn't the canonical approach to these questions. So I think early on, cultivating mentors who are of a wide variety, especially if you're interested in doing work that goes beyond the tradition of your field, you need to be creative in who you leverage to give you wisdom. And so that means not just using your direct mentors or who's right in front of you, but seeking out folks maybe in different disciplines, but whose values align with you, whose experiences can speak to what you're interested in studying and focusing on. Being really inclusive and again, valuing your own perspective and trying, and it's hard work because it's an easier road to just accept what one person, your direct graduate mentor, is telling you and reproduce that, right? But that is not how we innovate. So I think that especially in the liberal arts, we have core values around innovation, around interdisciplinarity, around taking in many different points of view. And so that background gave me and continues to give me strength to do those things, but just acknowledging that that is hard work, and also being kind to myself when I hit a wall sometimes, or when I feel, when I doubt myself. So I don't know if that directly answered the question about how to do that, but yeah, taking in lots of information and doing that. And then as far as the storied history of psychology, one thing I also want to point out is that psychology is a huge field, and it includes clinical psychology, which are folks who are mostly doing practice with individuals as therapists or as clinicians, and as well as clinical researchers who are trying to research those methodologies and how effective they are and where the drawbacks may be. And then myself, I'm in more of the basic research area where I'm interested in sort of the intersection of social identity. So that's much more like that. And then the applied side of what I do would be more like social work in some cases, or intergroup conflict mediation. And so on that side, I think being aware that each of these areas have their own pitfalls and negative pasts, and each have their own work to do, both individually and together as a whole field. So being part of those conversations is also very important.
Sweta, on the theme of innovating in light of dominant perspectives or widely held assumptions within a field, Sonia asks, what are some of the shortcomings of the SIR model?
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier for Diana's question, the SIR model is based on a very specific set of assumptions. And if you actually if the disease does not fall into that set of assumptions, instead of thinking of it has the shortcoming of SIR model, you create a brand new model. And that's where the category of SEIR model comes in. So one of the things that it doesn't take into account is the fact that a person can be asymptomatic, the SIR model, and it doesn't take into account if a person may be infected but not be infectious. It doesn't take into account what Diana was mentioning is if you are totally, if you do recover, if you are not totally immune, you come back to the susceptible population. So there are multiple assumptions that actually change what we need for example, for the COVID specifically. So yes, the shortcomings of the SIR model are important to know, and hence we need new models and with a new category of models. The SEIR model, as I mentioned, is not one model. So now there was another question in terms of what happens when like a population, people come in, and we didn't have, everybody was not, the planes had not stopped moving and everybody was still mixing from here and there. So we can't say population is fixed. That was one of the basic assumptions of SIR model. So there are a lot of shortcomings in terms of COVID-19. Hence, we need a brand new model. But what I was trying to do with the SIR model is the new model also has a similar kind of trajectory and how it is set up, but has many more complicated settings. So, which is why the SIR model does not really fit the COVID-19.
Great, thank you. That's wonderful. Reiko, I'm going to come to you now with a question we got from Michaela Zoe. Michaela Zoe is wondering, I would like to learn more about Natives and Black history and how Lewis and Clark will share their stories from their perspectives. I'm also curious to learn how the history department at LC is making active change in the community outside of the classroom. And she has one other follow-up that I will ask.
This is an ongoing challenge. It's a wonderful question and an ongoing challenge. I would hope that you will take advantage of the offerings under the umbrella of ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is an interdisciplinary program that is not just about lifting up those silenced stories, but about rethinking the nature of knowledge production entirely, and trying to challenge the ways in which these kind of dominant stories persist and become common sense. I would direct you to courses in our department on Native American history and African American history, and the US-Mexico borderlands, Latin American history, and looking for content in that way, but also looking towards ways that you can think about the curriculum more generally, as you said, or as others have indicated, that Lewis and Clark has its own history, not just as an institution, but its namesake. And we need to rethink the assumptions and ideologies that underwrite this notion of white pioneers as objects of celebration. I think that one thing to do is sort of not only seek out those courses, but find ways to develop your own independent projects, whether as a final project for a class or as work outside of the class. We are also really, I think, as an institution, moving towards making more deliberate efforts to connect with the city and not just see ourselves as in a kind of enclosed pastoral where we get to escape the problems of our communities, but really think about Portland as an extension of our classroom. I teach a course on the history of Portland, which attempts to do that. I know that Sarah Warren in SOAN, Sociology Anthropology, is teaching a social history of housing, which is also going to be rooted in Portland. I teach a course called the Inside Out Prison Exchange, which takes place in a local prison in which undergraduates and incarcerated students learn together side by side inside the prison from each other. And of course, a lot of this is going to be hampered by our current state of affairs, by which I mean COVID. But I think that there are always ways to make those connections between your academic work and whatever larger community engagement you'd like to participate in. Also looking to the Office of Leadership and Service, although that office keeps changing its name, so I might not be getting it right, and the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and what's it called now? EME? Sorry. But plenty of resources on campus, again, that are attending to ways that we can integrate that sort of personal sense of civic commitment to our broader community, as well as our own academic learning.
And Michaela follows up with wanting to know a little bit more about the concept of existential dread.
Just anything I want to share that's more. Okay, let's see. What could I share that might be interesting? So existential dread as this concept is the terror of death and dying. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about research on existential dread is that it seems that, there's debate about what people are really afraid of. Is it the ceasing to exist? Is it this gets really dark, the ceasing to exist? Or is it more about being disconnected from loved ones, right? So if we think about different religious perspectives on the afterlife, which is not my area of expertise, but if we think on these, they tend to involve a continuation of your life's trajectory. Like think about Valhalla, where you're continuing to feast and fight alongside your battle buddies, right? But the common thread is often going to be that you're connected to loved ones and they're with you in the beyond. And so that underscores perspectives by researchers like Mark Leary and Roy Baumeister, that really the action isn't about death fear, but it's about fear of being disconnected. And this links back to everything that we've been talking about with differences of opinion of the focus on the individual versus on the group and connection with others. So even with discussions and research on existential dread, there is this debate about really what we're so afraid of. So is it the anxiety of the end? Is it the process of death that you're afraid of? Is it the disconnection that might follow? And the attempts to bolster your self-esteem and your standing in the community do seem to align with this idea that we want to be connected with others even after that moment comes. So those are some things that I think are interesting about the research on existential dread.
Thank you. Sweta, you mentioned in your last answer that one of the limitations of the SIR model is this problem of immigration and immigration, the fact that populations don't hold still, they're always changing. Torin is wondering, how would you suggest as a mathematician that we deal with the problem differently?
So again, since my field is not specifically in epidemiology, I might not be able to give you the model, but I can try to explain in the sense of when, I'll try to use some math terminology, but I'm going to try to not be too complicated. So if you guys remember my presentation, there was these three relations that I wrote up, which is the rate of change of the susceptibles, the rate of change of infected, and the rate of change of the removed. But there was one assumption that we made, which is what this question is dealing with, which is S plus I plus R equals N. Now that value, what actually it ends up giving is an additional relation between the rate of change of S, I, and R. Because if you take the derivative, the N value, which is the constant population size, goes to 0. So when there is immigration, what you could possibly do is one of the assumptions that we say that the population is fixed, say like 50,000. Instead of that, make it also into a function. The population is also a function which changes with time, and that might just create a few more relations equations. So instead of having TSIR, that is time, susceptible, infected, and removed, and if we include the exposed, the N value, the population size, which was a constant, can also be now turned into a variable, N of T, which changes with time. And that might be one of the ways that can be dealt with. I'm sure there are other ideas, but that's one of the things that you can do, is change it into a function itself.
I'm not a math person, I understood that. Thank you for that answer. Reiko, I'm back to you. And we asked for questions from students, but we also got questions from our professor colleagues. So Will, who I think is Will Pritchard, is wondering, Reiko, you mentioned this idea that some stories need to be sung. And he's wondering, why do some stories need to be sung, and what kinds of stories in particular require of us a song?
Makes me want to cry. Makes me want to sing. I come back to maybe one way of answering that big question is to come back to thinking about the history of the discipline of history and what has constituted a legitimate historical source. It wasn't really until with a brief exercise in the 1930s was sort of like a discovery of folk culture in the context of modernization. But again, in the 1960s, in the United States anyhow, with the rise of the freedom struggle and the sort of collective efforts by ordinary people to topple racist and capitalist hierarchies, historians began to reconsider whose stories were worth telling. And so was born a movement called social history, or we might say colloquially, history from the bottom up. And this is a movement in historical writing that was happening all over the world. But just to speak to my context, one of those historians who was no doubt influenced by the civil rights movement and possibly by the songs of the civil rights movement was an historian who recently passed away named Leon Litwack. And he was not the first, but a prominent historian in the 1960s who began to look at spirituals and slave songs as an historical source. Because when you're looking at the social history of ordinary people, especially those who've been deliberately marginalized or silenced, their entrance into the historical record might take a different form than the traditional written text, based on questions of literacy, of surveillance, of cultural attributes. And as we know, enslaved people used song as a way to speak back to power without power knowing it. They used song as a way of engaging in satire, as a way of building collective identity, as a way of mourning, as a way of lament, of expressing pain, of speaking the unspeakable. And of course, song expresses feeling. No matter what culture, no matter what kind of music, it expresses feeling. And it is an opportunity to unite an individual personal experience with a collective. And it takes place in time, and it takes place in the body. And these are things that cannot be said for a traditional written text. And so I think, just to speak more broadly for a minute about the value of looking to other disciplines and other ways of knowing and other ways of recording and expressing than the written word, in my course on slavery, the final paper was an historiographical essay analyzing, various different interpretations of slavery from among the historians that we read. But students also had to produce a piece of artwork that expressed their relationship to studying the material. And the reason why I asked them to do this was that when we are engaged in the writing of history, we're not just telling a story, but we're making an argument. And we have to make that argument based on empirical evidence, and we raise questions and we answer them. But my understanding, and artists might disagree, but my understanding about the possibility of an artistic expression is that you can raise questions without answering them. You can explore ambiguity. You can grapple with your own role in relationship to the archive. That does not necessarily have a place in the traditional essay, but it's something that I wanted students to struggle with. What are the ethics of doing this work? How can we grapple with and reckon with the moral problem of slavery in our nation, our own responsibility as academics and historians? How can we express that struggle in a form other than the written word, which in the case of an academic essay requires a clear line of argument, precision, right? A certain kind of language. And again, as I was saying in my talk, we need different ways of telling stories, right? I was trying to express ways that a meaningful story differs from a chronicle of facts, how some stories get elevated over others. But I was also trying to express that we need all of the disciplines to tell the stories. And not just history, but art and music, not least because those express things that argumentative writing can't express, but also because they record experiences that otherwise wouldn't be recorded.
Excellent. That's really, you touched on a theme that I observed as I was listening to your three talks. There's this underlying current of, each discipline offering as a lens, a way to view the world around us. History offers our story, and from psychology and math were the notions of a model. Diana, I have a question for you from Katie, who is wondering about what we do when the model and our way of seeing the world doesn't align with the reality that's out there. So Katie wonders, given that Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been found to be inaccurate, how and why does it still apply to the current pandemic issues? And I would add, given what you told us about its backstory, why are we still talking about it?
Oh, geez. That's a really good question. And I think there's a stickiness to a lot of the theories that have originally been perpetuated in the fields. And when they get out there into popular culture, they can be adapted and used in these ways that feel really intuitive. And psychology, as with some other fields too, are kind of reaching a reckoning recently where we are advancing our principles about how to vet our research and data in more strict and helpful ways. Asterisk, that leads to some problems also. So when you have higher standards for the size of your samples, for example, that means that who are you cutting out of the research process, and what topics are you making less reachable to explore niche populations, for example, that don't have a lot of numbers. So every time you make an adjustment to the better, there's always going to be some cost as well. But we're having this reckoning right now where we're putting scrutiny on some of these older models, both how were they sourced, and also how well were they researched and analyzed in the first place. And it has been very challenging for us in the field to realize that, some of these things that we've all talked about for decades are now called into question. And then, once it's out of the bottle, it's hard to pull it back in, especially when it does feel intuitive. I wouldn't say that we need to, as I said at the end of my talk, it's not that we should throw out Maslow's model. We need to identify the places in which Maslow perhaps stole ideas from indigenous peoples, as well as be aware of how we can update those models in light of that knowledge and in light of current research. So for instance, there's research by Blackstock and others that looks at the breath of life model and trying to integrate ideas of indigenous ways of knowing back into Maslow's model. And rather than trying to change it, just to say, how can we acknowledge the fact that, for example, his original idea that we have to meet basic needs first and then move up this hierarchy is perhaps a Western view that we could maybe call into question, and rather think about these as more iterative and relational ideas that are in conversation with one another at all times and with the community. So I guess, to try to sum up my answer to this wonderful question, is that it's an ongoing challenge, especially when we know that confirmation bias, which is something that I teach about and think is just all over the place with regard to our political discourse, for example, where if you have an expectation already because you've been taught something at a young age, that's going to be very hard to dismantle in the face even of repeated evidence in opposition to your expectations. We are very conservative thinkers. We have, we're miserly with regard to changing our minds. And so that's why it sticks. And that means that we must continue to refine these models and also talk back and forth with the folks who are receiving this information from the field. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We're down to our last 5 minutes, and we're going to ask some closer to the ground types of questions that have to do with how you as professors are thinking about and preparing for the semester ahead. Shweta, I'm going to start with you. Sky asks, the liberal arts are about creating connections between students and their peers and their professors. How are you going to navigate that challenge and make sure to include virtual students in the social aspect of your part of the liberal arts experience this fall?
And that is a huge challenge right now, especially because I will be teaching remotely. So that's already with a 3-year-old at home that I had no other option. But one of the things that I'm thinking of, again, this is just something that is what I'm kind of working on already, is trying to come to campus, not just during the time where we're doing math, studying math or doing lectures, but actually have, again, social event, socially distanced event, but that which is not going to be only about math, because I think that was one of the features I've been always gotten comments from students is when there used to be office hours. Office hours were not strictly just for math questions. It would be math and what life. So it was always an opportunity for me to sit and talk with students. Now, of course, I'm going to still do that in the office hours, but I feel not having sort of being face to face, that's the one thing that is popping to my head, because I don't have a lab. Our brains are our labs. We are the only way I can introduce this sort of discussion is coming in person. Now, for the students who are remote, who are not, who are studying this classes remotely, I'm going to make, I've already have a list of people. So that's it's a constant kind of being in touch with them, finding out how it's going, how is the time varies. Some people, actually some students have told me they have a time difference of when my 8-10 classes, they are going to be in Hawaii at 5:30 in the morning. So I'm already concerned, like, how is the getting up in the early morning going to affect you? So I think having a personal connection, one-on-one for each individual student's needs, also based on this pandemic, is going to be critical. But I would not say I have a perfect plan for it, because there is no such plan, but that's what I'm going with right now.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to ask Diana and Reiko to respond to this next question in 30 seconds or less, so I can honor our participants' time. It says, how do you recommend that we do the work of uplifting knowledge systems that are ignored, erased, and otherwise disregarded? How do we promote the many ways of knowing and learning here at Lewis and Clark? So I'll go to Reiko first, and then we'll come to you, Diana.
Can I pass, please? Off to Diana.
You sure can.
Thank
I mean, I think the 30-second answer is having more varied voices in the room as much as possible. And then also, as Reiko had said in a lovely way and does embody in her work and teaching in the inside outside classroom, having experiences to connect with communities so that we further draw in different ideas and connections and ways of knowing, uplifting those, and then maybe kind of getting over ourselves with regard to what is the canon and what is the official knowledge versus what, being open to all ways of understanding the world around us and what's useful. And given that we're in a crisis, and many different types of crises, the time could not be better for opening our eyes to that.
I guess the one other thing I would say, and this might be controversial and unpopular, is something that I started to say at the end of my presentation, which is that you never know which stories are going to speak to you, and that people do not have to look like you for the story to resonate. I will say that again. The author of the story does not have to look like you, whatever that means, for the story to resonate. When I teach in prisons, one of the pieces that has most resonance for incarcerated people is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. W.E.B. Du Bois loved Shakespeare. Huey Newton, the Black Panther, studied Locke and Hume so he could make good arguments. Frederick Douglass was an Enlightenment thinker, right? So I just encourage you, all of you, that in this effort to listen to a multiplicity of voices, that we don't get into the rigid work of closing out the things that we, on first glance, think won't have anything to say to us. The value of a liberal arts education, as all of you have touched on in one way or another, is to find that sweet spot, that nexus, that messy nexus between the individual and the collective, the particular and the universal. What historians do is to study how things came to be common sense, right? And social movements challenge what we understand as common sense. But we historicize and interrogate what came to be seen as common sense. But there are things that are common sense. And we need to listen to all of it. We can't make an argument against it if you don't understand it. Yeah. So I would encourage you to be open in every which way.
That's wonderful. And that's really a great note for us to end this kickoff lecture webinar on. I really want to thank Reiko, Diana, and Sweta for not only working hard during the dark days of summer to prepare those presentations. We're going to hold them open and available for those of you who didn't get a chance to view them. Please go ahead and watch them. I want to extend my thanks to the 32 first-year students who submitted your questions. I know there's 7 of you who submitted live questions while we were going that we were not able to get to. I encourage you to follow up with us. One easy way to do that is to send your email to gened@lclark.edu. What we will do is we'll take that question and forward it to the specific panelist that it's intended to go to. And hopefully you can get an answer to your question. It's just that we don't have time to get to all of the questions. I promised you that we would have some prizes. So we have gotten out to the time, drum roll please, wherever you are, to announce the 5 winners of our LC swag. So first of all, we have Jack Rice. Second is Fiona Schrader, and then Kasia Schweiderman, and Huero Lopez, and finally, Jesus Castillo. Dawn, the administrative coordinator of the general education program, will be emailing the recipients by tomorrow to coordinate getting your prizes. Before we close out, I always like to think about one thing that I learned that I didn't know. And my favorite thing that I learned this afternoon is that I can think about math like being a stapler. That makes me a little more comfortable with it. I want to once again thank each and every one of you for joining us this afternoon. And thank you all for being a part of the Lewis and Clark community. Do take care of yourselves, stay healthy, take care of each other in this community. We are living in very difficult and trying times, but I do think that we're going to get through this. And of course, if you see any one of us, please say hi and do have a great semester ahead. We will be seeing you around. Take care.